Good evening. Good evening. I'm Eddie Glaude, Chair of the Center for African American Studies. And on behalf of the Center and Princeton University Press, I'm delighted to welcome you to the Toni Morrison Lectures. Last time we gathered, we witnessed and heard an extraordinary account of a broad and complex aesthetic theory, rooted in a deeply impactful encounter with John Cage and his 1958 composition, Indeterminacy. It was an irreverently reverent display of indebtedness and creative will, as well as an interpretive key for what we will experience tonight and the next time we gather. Fragments from Tuesday's lecture come to mind. It is the doing. Be free. It is what must be done. It is what must be done. What must be done. The sound of her voice. The selected stories were not random. An improvisational discipline. The reach for the authentic. The cry for a little more time was my own voice. Here we witnessed and heard the unique genius of Bill T. Jones, a multi-talented artist, choreographer, dancer, theater director, and writer, the co-founder and artistic director of the Bill T. Jones Arnie Zane Dance Company and executive artistic director of New York Live Arts, winner of numerous awards, the person, who has danced his modernist theoretical intervention into common sense, at least for some, and who has insisted on the artistic power of the wide range of experiences that make him uniquely him. Beauty and brilliance, the sublime, on full display. Jones's reflections on sound last time reminded me of an extraordinary moment in Toni Morrison's classic novel, Beloved. Ella and the women of the community had heard that the baby had come back, in the flesh, to haunt Setha. That literally the horror of history was consuming her. As Morrison writes, whatever Setha had done, quote, Ella didn't like the idea of past errors taking possession of the present, end quote. The women prayed, but Ella's eyes remained fixed on 124 as she recalled her own journey, her own act of infanticide. And then Morrison writes, she hollered, quote, instantly the kneelers and the standers joined her. They stopped praying and took a step back to the beginning. In the beginning, there were no words. In the beginning was the sound. And they all knew what that sound sounded like, end quote. It was the sound of his own grieving and beckoning voice in the confrontation with the grand corrective of futuristic dreams, death, that served as our transition to tonight's lecture. A mother in the coffin, an authentic experience, perhaps the authentic experience, frames story time. Ladies and gentlemen, the incomparable Bill T. Jones.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I would like to thank President Shirley Dickman and, of course, Eddie Glaude, Chairman of the Center for African American Studies, Professor Daphne Brooks, and the Toni Morrison Lecture Selection Committee. Thank you all very much for being here. A few things you should know. Tonight's lecture is the second of three. Tuesday's event was a free-form meditation on John Cage, the man, the artist, and the theoretician, and the influences his ideas and philosophy have had on me and a generation of like-minded creators. Tonight's lecture is a singular event made for this room. A 60-minute-long variation on Storytime, a Bill T. Jones, Arnie Zane Dance Company work we premiered this past January at Montclair State University's Castle Theater Peak Performance Series. Storytime was a response to John Cage's Indeterminacy, as Professor Glaude just said, a 1958 work in which he, John Cage, read 90 randomly arranged stories, each 1 minute long. Indeterminacy appealed to me because, as stated in my first lecture, it is both a comfort and a provocation in its encapsulation of pillars of John Cage's thoughts regarding time, content, intention, non-intention, as demonstrated by chance procedure. Buddhist philosophy within the poetry of performance. Tonight's event is collaboration with composer Ted Coffey, sound designer Sam Crawford, and with participation of artist Bjorn Amelon. The system of the storytelling, the system of the music, the system of the stagecraft are independent and meet indeterminately. Tonight's performance will have extreme lighting and sound in places, so please feel free to close your eyes and ears should you need to. But before we begin, let's play a little conceptual warm-up game. I'm going to ask you, without looking at your watches, Kyle Maud, our production stage manager, will tell us to go. And when you think 1 minute is over, just raise your hand. Shall we try it? Now be brave, raise your hand, and keep it up. Kyle?
All right, go. One minute.
There will be 60 of those tonight. Please enjoy Storytime, and as I understand, there will be a short PPD afterwards. Please enjoy. At Copenhagen's Opera House, there came a moment in tech rehearsal when the majority of the dancers were to stand still in a close group watching one woman performing a solo. A dancer at the front of the clump quietly began to draw attention to something of concern on the floor. The group's focus changed and everyone joined in, gesturing and commenting in an ever-rising murmur. Someone was bleeding. Observing them examining themselves and each other was like watching a pack catching the scent of prey. The soloist continued her movements as one man broke from the group and dashed into the wings. Returning a moment later, clutching paper towels, he went to work on the spots of blood. I could see at any moment the others would break rank as well. I asked him to rejoin the formation as the group was soon to resume dancing. Fortunately, several crew members had gotten the message and were down on hands and knees working at the blood. Around them, refocused and alert, the dance continued. The scene was bathed in a beautiful light. It was strange and lovely. John Coles was in the final stage of lung cancer. We went to visit him and Sage in their lovely loft in Minneapolis. John greeted us in his bathrobe. He was unshaven. There was an extremely long plastic tube connecting him to an oxygen tank. Still, over the 20 years I've known him, he had never been more dashing and full of fun. He insisted we drink champagne with him, popping the cork on a second bottle shortly before we left. In the hallway, near the elevator, was a poster of Last Supper at Uncle Tom's Cabin, the Promised Land. It has faded over the years, so we remarked to John that perhaps he might want to preserve it, as it had become something of a collector's item. With a mischievous smile and a shrug, he said simply, "Après moi." It was sundown in the summer of 1972, and Arnie Zane and I were standing, hitchhiking on the New York State Thruway, trying to get a ride home to Brockport from Buffalo. The state troopers had already threatened arrest if they caught us standing where we were. We had retreated up the ramp, but decided to risk going back as night was falling. For the week prior, we had been at New Vrindavan, the Krishna consciousness retreat in West Virginia, chanting and praying from before dawn to late into the night. The rhythmic clanging of cymbals, pounding of drums, and ecstatic shouts of Govinda Jaya Jaya Gopala Jaya Jaya. Govinda Jaya Jaya Gopala Jaya Jaya was still ringing in my ears, mixed with the whoosh and roar of 16-wheelers, family cars, and buses. We were very small, very high, and very alert as the stars came out. September 2011, yesterday, at Chicago's Art Institute, looking at a pile of candies, a work by Felix Gonzalez Torres. The audio guide explained that the pile of brightly colored sweets represented for the artist the body of his deceased friend and lover. Visitors were invited to take one to participate in the feasting that would devour us all. Today, just past dawn, leaving Chicago, I crawled into the back seat of a black sedan hired to take me to the airport. In the armrest between the seats are 2 unopened bottles of water, 2 packets of oil-controlling towelettes, and 2 brightly wrapped hard candies. I dreamed of the old house I grew up in on Miller Road.
John Henry, he was a steel driver. A little boy sat on his mama's knee, and he drove a 9-pound hammer load. Holland said, and I'm driving steel for me.
It was almost dark, and it might have been a Saturday night, because the house was empty, peaceful. I was alone in the kitchen with my dad, much older than he would have been at that time. We sat quietly, me holding his hand, massaging it. I asked if that helped him. His eyes were sad and smiling. He said gently, "That feels real good." In the summer of 1993, Arthur, Bjorn, and I were visiting Walter de Maria's lightning fields in southern New Mexico. We had reserved all 6 places in the guest house so we would have privacy. In the morning, Arthur had gone walking among the lightning rods. I was daydreaming when Bjorn called me to his room to help him with a panicked, vivid green hummingbird fluttering against the mosquito screen. A short while later, he had captured it and was cupping it in his hand when he offered it to me to do the same before we released it out the front door. I have seldom held a thing so fragile, so dependent on my care. I would like to think as it grew quiet and still, it trusted me. Though even now, I can recall the rapid beating of its heart on my palm. At some point in the late 80s, Betty Freeman rented Alice Tully Hall for one night so as to present the music of Lou Harrison, which had not been heard in New York for some time. It was a major event in the music world, and in the crowd was Virgil Thompson, who had known Lou Harrison for many years. Lou Harrison took the stage in a bubbly, flamboyant manner, describing in lengthy detail his preoccupation with the music of Asia, as opposed to the tyranny of that, quote, small tip of Asia Minor we call Europe. Virgil sat alone, swathed in an extravagant, colorful Afghani robe, which Bill Katz had just wrapped him in. Shouted at the top of his voice, talk, talk, talk. When do we hear the music? The mountains cup the mesa. As I look northeast towards Taos, caught in the harsh last rays on this first day of 2012. Taos, the sacred blue mountain, the pylons, the spindly power lines in gray-green sagebrush are stripped naked and apparent. I can see the bare outlines of Highway 68 in the distance, and even more improbably, individual cars and trucks, insect-like as the sunset catches on glass, metal, and chrome. I am here on the mesa because I do not want to be there in that small city or any city today, yet I grow obsessed with identifying man-made landmarks 10, 20, 30 miles away, or following those metal insects that seem to alight, take off, or hover around and through the distant drift of landscape, ever more abandoned by the retreating sunlight. It was the end of a festive lunch. Full of stories, wine, and good food, I was talking with my friend Peter, and he was saying how moved he had been to see a short documentary about my work on television. He loved seeing the dancing, but the footage of Arnie and me performing a study for Valley Cottage some 30 years ago disturbed him. When I asked him why, he said uncomfortably, "I wish I had been there. I wish I'd seen you guys then. Why did it have to look so old?" It was a Saturday morning in 1972. I had left Arnie relaxing in a patch of sunlight on the front stoop of our tenement, dressed in pink pedal pushers and a polka-dotted peasant blouse. His thick, dark hair was free and luxurious. I returned a few hours later. His outfit, like the demeanor, had become darkly masculine. His hair was pulled severely back. What happened, I asked. It seemed that a car full of young teenage men had started harassing him. Arnie had picked up a large, heavy metal drawer from a pile of junk and hurled it across a lane of highway, damaging their car. The driver screamed that he was going to get the police. Arnie dashed upstairs to adjust his appearance. Before long, the damaged car appeared, followed by a police vehicle. As the young driver opened his mouth, Arnie announced, "Officer, I would like to file charges against these young men." The young driver's eyes bulged. As he stammered, the police ordered him to shut up, get back in the car, and show his license. The cop turned to Arnie saying, "I'm so sorry, sir. It's a shame about these young people. The parents are the problem." Just outside the French windows at our hotel in Phoenix was a concrete balcony that we never used. It was splattered with birds dropping amid mess, sitting exposed and forlorn on the concrete. There was a shabbily constructed nest, little more than a few twigs, and in its middle, one egg. It was not abandoned, however. Every day for the remainder of our stay, a pigeon sat on it and was still doing so when we checked out. In 1999, we premiered a work in 3 parts called "We Set Out Early, Visibility Was Poor." The second section, Kate Barlow, was performed to a recording of John Cage performing "Empty Words" at the Teatro Lirico in Milan. The audience of revolutionary young students began to riot in response to Cage's reading Walden Pond, not the text as written, but phonemes or word fragments chosen by chance procedure. Later, over dinner, Stephen Wright, a manager of symphony orchestras, said of both Cage and Schoenberg, "For practically 70 years, conductors and impresarios have been trying to force this stuff on audiences. When will they realize people just don't like it? Audiences simply don't want it. It doesn't work." It was March. A light snow was falling. Uzuyuki, the Japanese call it. And though I was grateful for the heart-breaking beauty of snow on weighted bamboo, the lattice work of budding trees and the frosted granite boulders, I fell into comparing this March evening with that evening 24 years ago when it was warmer. Forsythia were in bloom everywhere, as the neighborhood seemed to be holding its breath, and Arnie Zane was dying upstairs. In the bedroom. That would always be March. I had not spoken to Lily Mae since her husband Harris, my eldest brother, died a few years before. I was calling to locate family photos of the 1940s, 50s, and 60s for various documentary projects. Lily Mae was very warm. She told me he had hidden the photographs as his Alzheimer's progressed, and though she had looked for them after his death, she had no idea where they could be. She spoke of her initial skepticism at the idea that there was anything wrong with his mind. That changed the day he walked out of the house, waving his children away dismissively as they called him, asking where he was going. He grew ever more fearful, often hiding outside in the bushes. He became violent, striking her in the face once as she asked him to sit down for lunch. She was obliged to hide all knives and an old shotgun he would sit out front holding. When the end came, though he barely recognized her, he tried to hold her hand, only able to grasp 2 fingers. She quietly encouraged him to let go. She knew he had passed when he released her hand and was still. At the opening of a new concert hall in Dortmund, Germany, dignitaries were in attendance. It was to be an all-Beethoven program. At one point, the music stopped as Professor Wapniewski, an elderly man with spectacles and white tousled hair, proceeded to speak in German. Members of the orchestra and the chorus sat perfectly still until they, like everyone in the room, realized that he was going to speak for a very long time and began to fidget. At least 2 people way up high in the chorus fell asleep. Later, Bjorn, who speaks the language, tried to reconstruct highlights of the speech. It seems it had been about values and the loss of them, honor, language, culture, tolerance. There was one thing that sticks with me, although I am not sure I got it right. We believe society should offer freedom and equality, yet freedom is the permission to be individual, and individuality is the opposite of equality. As a plane flies over a city, there comes a moment when one looks out and tries to recognize distinct objects below a train, or a semi-truck smaller than a matchbox, then later a person maybe. We don't have a reason for this. Sometimes the one on the ground looks up. They probably hear the engines first, or see our shadow. In Diary, How to Change the World, You Will Only Make It Worse, John Cage says, "They taught us art was self-expression. You had to have something to say. They were wrong. You don't have to say anything. Think of the others as artists. Art is self-alteration. I have stopped the CD 4 several times today, most often to go back and write down something John Cage said. Just now, I stopped it to write what I am thinking, and that is a question. Out of the many things he reports, do I get involved only with those I agree with, or with those that make me uneasy? On a warm late spring day in 1992 in Prague, I took a crowded bus with my mother, Estella, and Arthur Aguiles to the Theresienstadt concentration camp. Unfortunately, the bus did not go to the camp itself, but instead dropped the 3 of us in the village nearby and left us to beg a ride as best we could. Stunned, we sat on a bench in the deserted square. Eventually, a couple of German tourists gave us a ride to the camp memorial. It seemed deserted. I remember little about the immense place other than the green of its gently rolling hills and the many stone markers scattered across the landscape. Estella didn't understand the significance of the place and assumed I had made this difficult journey to take her to a cemetery. We strolled around for a while and then sat on a bench under a tree to rest. Estella, fanning her broad, sweating face with a handkerchief, declared, "Son, I've always heard that if you really want to learn to pick the guitar, you got to work at it all night in the graveyard." Oh yes, sure enough, the next day you'll be able to pick John Henry. You'll be able to play that thing. Betty Freeman was a great friend to contemporary music and a friend of mine. I met her at Bill Katz's loft the same night I met John Cage. She sat next to Cage at the far end of a long table between him and Jasper Johns. As Arnie and I entered the room, she asked Bill, "Who is that? He's a dancer, right?" Bill sat me near her and John. At one point, she asked Cage to tell a story. As he began speaking, she interrupted, saying, "Not that one, John, the other one. Now, after 30 years, I can't remember either story." Kyle, my clock has stopped. Flooded McDonald's. Our brightly lit McDonald's being slowly flooded gave a wicked, vindictive pleasure as French fries fell in the water, then floated to the surface. It was hilarious witnessing a Happy Meal carton amid soaked hamburger buns caught in a small whirlpool cascading past the Coke machine. One catches one's breath and then laughs out loud as the cash machine explodes in the rising muck. The red, the yellow, and the white room fills till all the lights blow out and the camera takes us underwater where the dead food and garbage become somber, sad, and mysterious. I was rehearsing my solo show at Aaron Davis Hall's Studio B one Saturday morning. Estella was visiting us from San Francisco and sat gently in a row of chairs, watching me dancing to a recording of Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau singing Schubert's Litanei auf das Fest aller Seelen, Litany for All Souls Day. Knowing she was no fan of German romantic music and suspecting she was only slightly more interested in what I would do to it, I assumed Estella was not listening. However, when I stopped, she said, "That one I like." It was so pretty. Every year from approximately the middle of December to the first week of January, Bjorn and I spent time on the mesa of northern New Mexico. It's quiet and open there with mountains all around. The sky shifts constantly, as does the wind and the light. Still, one has the impression that nothing changes. In fact, it feels like the sort of place one might create in the future when we can custom make a virtual vacation spot. One afternoon, halfway through my holiday, I was determined to listen to John Cage read Indeterminacy Part 2 for inspiration and as a means of getting away from the list of things, people, and feelings inside of me. In the Mesa light and quiet, I was writing this story as I was listening to his recording, attempting to name the very things I was trying to forget. I saw a show of Pat Steer's paintings at Hein Reed Gallery. They were large format paintings juxtaposing two vertical panels of color. Sometimes one of the color panels was hid behind a curtain of streaming paint of another color. At other times, the streaming curtain covered both halves. But it was at the center seam where the two panels met that the cascading rivulets and streaks were most dramatic, like tears, perhaps. They were called winter paintings. As we stepped into the street, it was raining, cold, and overcast. It was the third day of spring. At Bard College during a lull in rehearsal. In Theater 2, I was leaving the stage as dancer LeMichael was returning to it, applying a Band-Aid to his finger. Battle wound, I asked, assuming he had done it just now in rehearsal. No, I did it at breakfast. Walking away from him, I turned as he continued, but it was an accident. I think it was a joke. Still, I had a momentary barrage of images, a self-inflicted death by 1,000 cuts, a God who out of uncontrollable anger devours himself until there is only his eyes and ravenous mouth left. LeMichael, making breakfast of himself, one finger at a time. In the late fall of 1989, I mentioned to Virgil Thompson that I was going to spend New Year's in Venice, my first visit there. Virgil said, "Venice, it's wonderful, but you must never go alone. It's too tragic." Rockland Lake is overpopulated with Canadian geese. The problem became acute some years back with so many complaints about the aggressiveness of the birds and their filth that the authorities decided to take drastic action and under cover of darkness, killed many of them. Some in the community were so appalled that they compared this clandestine action to exterminations committed by the Nazis. Processing the meat, grinding it up into goose burgers with the intention of feeding these to the homeless, the authorities tried to put the best spin on it. Unfortunately, the meat was inedible as it was gravely tainted with PCBs. On the Mesa, in the casita, writing this lecture, tending the fire, watching the first sunset of 2012, reading a book of John Cage's writings, attempting a story about the falling light while carrying on a text message exchange with my nephew Avani. It is nerve-wracking, exciting, and completely indeterminate. One thing is missing, an organizing system, like time limits to each activity. I could have used a clock, but I made do with the sunset.
Anna, or was it Estella, told the story of a young male relative in the South living on a remote farm back in the days when young boys had to wear short pants. As the story goes, he was sitting on a fence, looking down the road that ran past his family's farm when his mother said, "Hey, today's your birthday, and you a man." Without so much as a word to anyone, he went into the house, changed from short pants to long ones, and left, never to be heard from again.
It was the fall of 1974 in Binghamton. I moved in a fog of guilt and uncertainty, convinced that the only reliable life for me would be monastic. I was practicing yoga and chanting Hare Krishna daily. A guru had to be the solution. After all, when the student is ready, the teacher appears. Alone, down on my knees, performing my job at the university library, a voice said, "I have been looking for you." I looked up into the face of a handsome East Indian man beaming down at me. I was thunderstruck. Actually, he had been looking for a space to conduct his meditation classes, and someone must have told him I was a member of a dance collective with a loft in downtown Binghamton. I became one of his students, a vegetarian, and proposed celibacy to Arnie. On Saturday morning at a street fair, I bumped into Morrison, my teacher, eating a hot dog and strolling with his wife. I was shaken, though nothing was said then or later. He did teach me a number of mind-focusing exercises. We saw less and less of each other, and then he moved away. Max Roach told of the day when Abby Lincoln and he were excitedly putting the finishing touches on a Thelonious Monk tune, to which Abby had written lyrics. They were excited because Monk himself was to come by. He came. Listened intently to their performance, whispered something into Abby's ear, and then left. Max asked her what Monk had said. And here, Max, doing a perfect imitation of Monk's curiously gruff, gravelly speech, whispered, "Next time, make a mistake." My sister Odessa tells me that on the morning after my father had died of a heart attack, members of the family were gathered at my mother's apartment. Estella, always emotional, was completely transported by her grief. Weeping, shouting, sometimes praying, she went through ever-mounting peaks of emotion. Her San Francisco Railroad apartment, a series of rooms connected by a long hallway, resounded with her agony. Estella, at 200 pounds, crashed about her living room, kicking and screaming like a child, pushing away anyone who tried to comfort her. At one moment, howling, she threw herself on the floor and proceeded to roll from one end of the hallway to the other, as a child would on a grassy hillside in the springtime. I've always enjoyed this story. John Aubrey reports in his brief lives that Edward de Vere, Earl of Oxford, acutely embarrassed at breaking wind in the presence of the Queen, had imposed upon himself 7 years of exile. On his return, the Queen said, "My lord, we had forgotten the fart." I left Bjorn and Jenny Milheiser upstairs chatting at the Mandarin Hotel as I went in search of a cool spot to waste some time in before our next meeting downtown. The Warner Center and its summer crowds drove us out to Columbus Circle's fountain. Sitting amidst others seeking a breeze and resting their legs, I thought of a conversation Arnie Zane had in Waterloo, Iowa in the 1980s with a German friend of mine, Al Sack. Arnie had been shocked when Al said he was glad to leave New York City because there were way too many different kinds of people there. He appreciated getting back to Iowa, where people were more alike. Two Bears by Hafiz. Once, after a hard day's forage, two bears sat together in silence on a beautiful vista, watching the sun go down and feeling deeply grateful for life. Though after a while, a thought-provoking conversation began which turned to the topic of fame. The one bear said, "Did you hear about Rustam? He has become famous and travels from city to city in a golden cage. He performs to hundreds of people who laugh and applaud his carnival stunts." The other bear thought for a few seconds. Then started weeping. Dora Amelon tells wonderful stories about her life. She is 90 years old, but remembers many details from her younger years. When she is enjoying a good meal, she will sometimes quote her father, Carl, who must have been quite witty with an ironic sense of humor, whom, when asked how he was enjoying a delicious meal, would quip, "There is better, but it is more expensive." I had recently worked restaging a show at the National Theatre in London. My production supervisor was a delightful, warm, and very capable woman called Toni. The opening night was triumphant. At the party afterwards, we were all standing together having a drink when someone asked how I had found working with her. I was very happy with her and the whole experience at the National, so happy in fact that I decided I too would be ironic and humorous. "There is better, but it is more expensive," I said. I could see she was shocked. I tried to explain, but it was too late. "You're not an old Jewish man," she said. "Just say something nice next time." I knew the monologue as Spalding Gray casually in the 1980s. He and Renee Shafransky, a woman I had known from the cinema department in Sunny Binghamton in the 1970s, were a couple for a while and went out for dinner together once. All I remember of the evening is walking across Prince Street between West Broadway and Thompson Street talking about memory. I asked Spalding if he had read Proust, who demonstrated something profound about memory in his great novel. Spalding didn't seem very interested. Dropping his eyes and his voice, he muttered, "No, I haven't." Small voice thinking. Doriki, about 7 years old, had left everyone else and sat alone on his great-grandmother Estella's bed very quietly, doing nothing. Or so I thought as I came into the room. Doriki felt me looking at him, turned and said, there must be about 1 million things. I said, where? He answered, you know, everywhere. After braving sleet, snow, and ice, we finally reached a diagnostic clinic. On Lower 2nd Avenue for a routine medical procedure that required anesthesia, or a really lovely sleep, as the anesthesiologist described it. I was taken to examination bay number 6, a simple bed with a curtain on a track that the nurse pulled closed while instructing me to undress, put on a gown, and wait. All the staff was cheerful and polite. As the only partitions were drawn brown curtains, the various conversations filling the air were actually heightened as I lay obediently in my hospital gown under a warm blanket. My nurse asked if I had a power of medical attorney document or a DNR, do not resuscitate. I told her I did not, to which she gently responded, in the future though, you should have such a document and carry it with you. It does not matter here today, because if something goes wrong, we will do everything possible to revive you no matter what. Just as I was settling into my assignment of writing down John Cage's report of an answer Jasper Johns was giving to a Swiss journalist, phone rang. Nothing was addressed. After I hung up, there was that still space I felt whenever I stopped the John Cage recording. We had just seen Bill Cunningham in New York, a documentary about the New York Times photographer. He is an interesting character, very much of the old genteel world, so much so that when asked if he were gay, he answered that his family never spoke of such things, and as a result, he never given it much thought either. He is a man in his 80s. A solid bridge to another time, like Merce Cunningham, who is now gone. Leaving the film and passing the Joyce Theater, we saw that Merce Cunningham's company would be doing one of its last seasons there. It was a Monday night. The marquee was not lit. It was sobering seeing Merce's name as night was falling on a darkened marquee. As I lay in bed, left hand gone numb, holding the iPad, right hand pecking at the keyboard, trying to start another story, A story about something that happened almost 40 years ago. An uncanny thing happened, commonplace yet strange. I lay on my back and through a corona of mist, a perfectly round moon revealed itself. I thought that saying the moon revealed itself to me was like a pool of water laying claim to the ring of light that plays on its surface. In some seasons, the full moon glares in the middle of the night, but that night and at that moment, the mist and the moon itself were gentle and personal. However, the time spent struggling with typing, poor spelling, and a small thought, barely able to tug along a big feeling, was too much for the moon. It was still there when I turned away from the screen, but it was no longer mine. At a luncheon one day in Washington, I sat next to Geoffrey Holder. At one point, I asked Geoffrey his opinion on my choice for a new stage work based on Superfly, the movie. He said, marvelous. I asked Geoffrey what he thought people would think about me making a work based on what they might think was an exploitation of black culture and black people. He mouthed the words, fuck them. During a studio visit in Skowhegan, an artist showed me childhood pictures of himself and his family in which, with a magic marker, he had crudely scribbled himself out, so what one saw were groups of smiling people, most often looking at the camera, and in their midst, a shadow. I asked him if he were angry. I can no longer remember what. He said, when I last saw Estella in the hospital bed, she barely recognized me, and yet when they placed one of her great-grandbabies on her chest, and the little one started rooting around, grunting with pleasure, pulling at her nightgown and cheeks, sucking on her chin, her eyes opened and she smiled. Estella wanted nothing more than to stand up, but the best she could do was to sit in a specially constructed chair placed there by nurses and a lift team. Barely able to speak, Estella wanted to sing, and she sang the same old song over and over. Walk with me, Lord, walk with me. Walk with me, Lord, please walk with me. While I'm on this tedious journey, walk with me, Lord. Harris, my oldest brother, told me this story. One day in the 1930s, when he was a small boy in the South, Estella's first of 12 children, he was with his mother and her best friend as they finished picking the cotton in one field and had to walk a considerable distance to another. A car with two white men in the front seat offered them a lift. Reluctantly, the two young women and the 3-year-old Harris got into the back seat. The two men, talking and laughing with each other, began to casually reach back to grope between the women's legs or feel their breasts. I can't remember why he told me this story so many years later, but do remember the strained look of distaste on his face as he recounted how both women were silently weeping, shoveling the small boy between them as protection from the men's hands. Another story my mother told me. I'm not sure if she witnessed it or if she recalls her mother Anna's memory. Here too, there is a small child, 3 years old or so, much loved and curious to a fault. It seems that the family was living in a small shack. There was a rundown tenement somewhere in the south, and the children were often left alone. The apartment was infested with rats, and rat poison was placed in holes in the walls. Was it its shape, its color, its smell? For whatever reason, this small child was fascinated with it. She was found stiff as a board, standing dead on tiptoe with her face in the wall, as thus said. Wooster Street at Houston, the last day of spring. Indulging in a bit of racial looking, I noted how Soho had so many more young black men and women walking in the streets. The police had put up barriers at the intersection behind which many of these young people in swagging jeans, t-shirts, baseball caps, sneakers, and backpacks were surging in anticipation of what? I reached down into my bag for a pen and sat back up just as the crowd broke through the barriers into Houston Street's traffic in pursuit of a black SUV in which we could see a laughing black face and an extended arm stretched out the back window, videotaping the shrieking crowd's futile attempt to overtake it. The chances of hailing a cab seemed slim on 9th Avenue and 43rd Street. The heat, wall of buses and taxicabs changing, shift, not to mention the crowds of people on the streets and at every intersection made it difficult to move. Much less be noticed standing in the gutter, signaling. I walked a bit further down to 42nd Street and trudging across the intersection saw a large woman in a pair of ill-fitting shorts bending forward. She was brown-skinned with a remarkably ruined body and a face to match. She was looking back over her backside and saying with a terrible verve and bitter humor to someone in the crowd, "You know what you can do with that, don't you? You can stick it right in here," as she pointed to her ass. It was a rainy night in Washington, D.C., and we found our way to a large Italian restaurant, L-shaped, almost shrine-like, with vitrines featuring cakes and curiosities at the entrance, walls covered with paintings, religious objects, and fake plants. There were many shelves lining the walls on which every possible surface was crowded with objects of glass or ceramic. A man sat eating dinner alone at the bar. At one point, he laid his head on his folded arms as if sleeping or weeping. One should not read into others' public behavior, I thought. I stopped looking at him, fearing should he catch me looking, one or both of us would be embarrassed. Summer of 1981 or so, when I was performing a solo on a makeshift stage as part of a day-long arts festival in Milwaukee. My friend Renata Sack had driven from Waterloo, Iowa to see me and join her good friend Ruth Dow. Just recently returned from China. That afternoon I went shopping with the two of them in a vast vintage clothing warehouse. At one point, they were suggesting shirts that would suit me. Ruth held to my chest a 50s era shirt in red and gold, asking how I liked it. I said with some scorn, "I'm not into nostalgia." She answered, "Oh, but you will be." It was early March, and the first truly spring-like day. I was setting breakfast outside in the garden, listening to the radio, as Brian Lehrer spoke with a politician about the efforts to dismantle public broadcasting. In my mind's ear, I could hear my dancer, LaMichael, shouting, and fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, I'll be perfectly free, God damn it. Suddenly, in the morning sunshine, like two dancers taking the stage, a couple of robins spiraled upward in glorious flight, mating in midair. March 23rd, 2011, 5:50 p.m. I am composing this story, driving north on 10th Avenue. Intermittently, throughout the day, I have been feeling like crying or breaking something. I wonder if this story is better if I don't explain. Why? March, thinking back to the first showing of Storytime in Phoenix. Simon Dove had complained that he could not understand the structure, as in a work so dependent on 1-minute increments, events and stories sometimes ended early or late. Later, he said to me, I hope I don't have to explain myself. I answered, no. However, later that day and for weeks, I thought, yes, hell yes. Toni Mo was my grandmother's cousin. Perhaps she was not even related, but this detail is lost as all the players are now long since dead. Toni Mo was a much-beloved child who, through her considerable charm and beauty, affected all who came in contact with her. As the story goes, she must have been about 4 or 5 years old when my grandmother, Anna Edwards, herself only 9 or 10, was visiting Toni Mo and her family. Toni Mo's father was pumping kerosene from a small tank into the stove one evening. Toni Mo was entertaining all the other children when a freak accident occurred, whereby the pump shot a jet of flaming fuel that set the child ablaze. She was fatally burnt, but she did not die immediately. Wrapped in white cotton and fat, she held on for many days, calling my grandmother, whom she loved, by name, saying over and over, Anna, Anna, my daddy done burnt me up. After all of Antonio's years of experience, people were still telling him they think it's easy to settle down, but they never thought how he thought. Antonio could have a woman that he loves and that treated him right, and still that would never stop him from having double desserts in every town. Tour was a wonderful thing. The adventure got him every time, but that was the thrill of it. Antonio was always ready to release himself at any moment with any woman. He was a pro at it, but he still wasn't satisfied. In fact, he was lonely. It didn't hit him until one day he remembered the great words from his wise mother. She would always say, you have 2 heads to think with. Always trust the one with 2 eyes, not just the one. 2 eyes are always smarter than one. As Artie Zane set up his camera to photograph Louise Nevelson on the roof of the Stanhope Hotel in San Francisco in 1973, they chatted. Nevelson was in her late 50s, wearing her signature floor-length paisley coat with chinchilla lining, a headscarf, 3 sets of false eyelashes, and a jockey's cap. "What do you do other than photos?" she asked. "I'm a dancer," he said. "Fantastic. Every artist must dance. Now, shall we begin?" Nevelson hawked up a wad of phlegm and spat it out, and then, like a fashion model, pulled the fur around her and stared directly into the camera's lens. Walking in Singapore looking for a massage. They all seem the same, though some offered a kind of ear therapy wherein paper-thin sheets of wax are melted into one's ear, then carefully removed, ostensibly dragging impurities out. The young woman tending to me would or could not explain what I would experience. I lay there on my side in a state of alarm, as it seemed an impossible amount of hot wax was being directed into my ear canal. Just when I thought I couldn't stand it any longer, and without warning, she ripped it out, refusing to show it to me. I had been unaware and uninterested in these impurities when they were inside my body. But now, as they were outside, I was desperate to see them. During a snowstorm, Cecil Taylor, Arnie Zane, and I stepped into the Blue Note, shaking off the snow and the uncanny stillness of 6th Avenue. Cecil introduced us to an array of personalities, some well-known, all lovers of jazz, and Abby Lincoln in particular, who sat quietly at the bar in between sets. This was the treat Cecil had promised us earlier that evening. We had met at the insistence of Max Roach, who envisaged a collaboration between Cecil himself and the two of us from the Brooklyn Academy of Music's brand new Next Wave Festival. Meeting with Cecil, he had quickly dismissed Max as, quote, that old bebop drummer, and passionately insisted we consider Abby Lincoln instead, as he was more than intrigued by her style, this thing she does, past words, past singing. He kept repeating, "Man, it's a sound she makes, a sound." Michel O'Dare was sharing his latest multimedia, monitor, video diary work with a small group of friends. Each tiny screen was a non-stop collage of imagery culled from 30 years of looking via a handheld video camera. Though the various screens did sometimes echo or comment on each other, there was a great deal of chance, giving the entire work a scattered and ecstatic quality. The viewer was required to glide above and scan individual events, to abandon any attachment to particular images. This generated a sort of vertigo when one resisted the flow. Later, over dinner, I made an awkward attempt to explain to Michel how his work had forced me to confront my own seeing selection process. Always brusque and humorous, Michel said, "You motherfucker, you are thinking about yourself while watching my work." How you doing? Well, we have a little time left. If you would like to ask me any questions or make comments to myself, Ted Coffey, or Bjorn Amelon, we would be pleased and proud to entertain them. Yes, ma'am.
I love your images, the way you painted images.
I think they're going to give you a microphone. We're going to do Oprah.
I just wanted to say how much I appreciate how you used images in such these really quick vignettes. It was like a race, but at the same time, so beautiful and moving. I especially love the way you mentioned the moon and how that affected you. That one vignette.
Oh, so that one landed with you, huh?
I love that one,
Ah.
and I also love the one where. Well, anyway, they're all. I could go on and on. We'll let someone else.
Well, it's interesting. You know, I would have loved to have heard a PPD following John Cage doing it. You know, because it seems that I like the fact that you say you liked, you loved. Because I'm not quite sure what he wanted you to feel about content. You know, yeah, it's interesting about content. Eddie.
Could you talk a bit about lighting and sound in relation to the
Yes.
vignettes?
Music or sound design? Well, I don't think I have much to say. Laura back there? Laura, do you have anything to say about the lighting?
So for the story time that we do in the theater, oh hi there, I'm sure I can project.
We change the lighting states with every minute. So part of what we did here today was stripping it down so that we were creating simple, strong gestures every 10 minutes. And we were able to show contrasting directions of light, contrasting colors. And it's really, when we do it normally in story time, they're randomly generated. And this time we did it also randomly generated with some idea of changing the direction of the light.
Well,
Any other specific
sensibility
question?
sensibility comes
It
in
does.
when Janet or I say to you,
Correct.
the changes
Yeah.
should take. How do you decide how fast or slow things should move?
It's really one of the things that the designers set up when we first designed this, Robert Rosell designed this, was that there needs to be a noticeable shift that shows you that time is changing, that time is passing. So each minute, normally we do the changes a lot more quickly, and this time we tried something different, which was that the time that the light shifts is also randomized. So we had more like 10 seconds, 15 seconds, 20 seconds, longer periods of time, which I think worked well. If you only have 10 states over 60 minutes, it works better to have those be a little more slow. So, any other specific questions about lighting? How did you guys feel being blinded? Raise your hands if you hated it. Okay, that's part of it. Part of the point is to make you feel uncomfortable.
No.
Don't give it
I
away.
don't know what part.
Yeah.
Why did you hate it? Here's the lady right here, and then we'll come back to Ted. I think it's yes.
Drastic classicism. Been there, done that.
What
Been
does
assaulted.
that? What does that mean?
Drastic classicism. What's her name?
Carol Armington.
Yes.
Yes.
That was probably the first real big choreographic assault that I experienced.
Was this choreographic?
Having light shone in your face was choreographic, yes.
How was that choreographic?
Stuff was moving in space.
You mean
and
like light?
coming.
You know, like when you're driving on a country road and the car comes and lights go in your face?
Well, you were present in relation to the light,
Yes.
so you changed too.
So why did this make you upset?
Well, because I don't like light coming in my face.
I don't think that's really strong enough, though. I don't think it's really, you got to put yourself behind it more. To say you hate something, a friend of mine said you should only say you hate Nazis. To say you hate an aesthetic event is strong. It's strong. People fought.
I used to have more patience.
So you became impatient. You don't like to be impatient. So should I care about that? Pardon? Pardon?
I mean, she asked a question and my hand shot up before I even
Thought
thought
about
why I
it.
was answering.
Yes, right. Well, I'm purposely picking a fight because this is what we talked about over dinner today as being a time-honored avant-garde gesture. I said it was done in Winter Branch with Merce Cunningham with lighting by Robert Rauschenberg back in the 60s in a piece protesting the Vietnam War. And my friend Alessandra, the Italian writer, informed me that she felt that they were doing similar things in the 1920s. Why do you think people do these things? Why do you think artists do these things? Because they're perverse and they want to make you unhappy, pissed off? Why do you think they do it? This is a lecture about the life of an idea, all about context and content. That's why I thank you for it, but we're here supposed to be thinking about thinking about ideas and traditions and gestures over time. Been there, done that means, Mr. Rauschenberg, I think you did it, but it's even done in the 20s, so it's exhausted. Is that what you're saying? Okay, I won't put you with, but is the idea exhausted?
Depends
What do you mean? Depends.
on the context, like you say.
So was it exhausted for you?
No.
Aha, aha, yes. Well, aha. What do you say, Bill? You're writing a little note there. Right. Uh-huh, I see you. You can't hide, brother. Right, right. Yes, is the idea exhausted? This is the question, the life of an idea. This is the science of art making. And it is all about context. And it's about time. And it's about the eyes that see it. Today, I had to give that little speech because I was told by my minder, if I can call you that, Jennifer, that people, she didn't say people here, might need to know that I know that the lighting in your eyes is going to be hard. Therefore, I should say it. And that people should know that I know that the sound is going to be loud, and believe me, it was kind tonight. So what is that about? Now, these ideas are old ideas, and yet I have to tell you it's going to happen. The life of an idea. Ted, did you want to say something?
Hello.
Yes.
Sure, so the music also, there were a couple points of contact which you may have noticed, a couple times in which the text of the story had something to do with the text of the music, or it was just kind of suspiciously sympathetic to what was going on with Bill. But for the most part, it was also largely randomly, the sequence is random. The materials are, Bill has about 177 stories written, and I have much more music than is necessary for this span of time, so we're always pulling from the materials that we have. And so there, to make variety, to make a unique collection of stuff. And however, there's a lot of kind of thematic unity or sets of materials, classes of materials that are consistent. So there's stuff formed from Japanese instruments, there's stuff formed from folk elements, and there are ambient textures, there are environmental textures, and so those are all, it's set up so that, I think, so that connections, that there are a wealth of connections to be made for those who are, who happen to make them, something like that.
For those who really want to make them.
Right. Or it can just be a big wash.
Yeah. This was supposedly made in a brave new world where people actually, John Cage supposedly felt that there were three aspects of creation. There was the act of composition, there was the act of execution, and there was the act of audition, or being a spectator in the audience. He didn't think they were related. And he prized creation and what the artist could learn over the audience's experience even. Now, how do you like that in the era of market research? Right, and the fact that you want to sell a few more tickets, few more million tickets, so you change the ending of a Broadway film, a Broadway show, or a major motion picture. This is why this is such this way of working is a comfort and a provocation to me. A comfort because it gives you permission to not care. And a provocation because if I am one of the 99%, right? Let's not take it to economics, but in a way, you know, how do I feel about you, what you are asking me to watch? Particularly, did you all buy these tickets or were they free? Okay, so I don't owe you doodle then, do I? Yeah, right. 60 minutes, pardon? 60 minutes, aha, no, you owe me 60 minutes. I gave you something. You know, I didn't jack up on stage here, right? We worked at it, we thought about it, and we lovingly installed it. And you didn't have to pay anything, all we asked is 60 minutes of your attention. So what's the exchange? What's the exchange? What's the value of it? Yeah? Think about this work in the marketplace today. Yeah? It has like 0 value, right? So what does that mean in the mind of the people that actually make decisions about culture? Let's not go there. This is supposed to be Princeton University talking about ideas, right? That's supposed to separate us right now from the craven unwashed on Madison Avenue, right? Or does it? The life of an idea. What is freedom? What is pure inquiry? What's worth doing? Speaking of which, anything for Mr. Amelon, who I brought into this tonight because I've always been curious about his process and how his process, which is non-theatrical, what happens when he's put into a theatrical environment. Anybody? Yes, sir.
It's not an exciting question, but I was just curious when he was doing the bamboo, there was one section where he didn't put leaves on it. Whether that was intentional or, and why.
You know, it was very difficult to know what I was doing because I made a point of not stepping back and looking. So I realized, this is the first time we do this exercise, I realized that it's actually very difficult to know the big picture, especially as it's in 2 halves that moves, right? And it's big. And it's, so I think that if there were no leaves there, I hope it looked okay.
I don't know whether this is worth saying, but...
What a polite group, so self-effacing, right?
But when you, after you did the 3 panels, I think you did 2.5 panels of bamboo, when you started erasing the first panel, my heart, it just was heart-rending. I felt so sad. I was already attached to it.
That makes me so happy.
And that is I think that's the courage of John Cage, don't you think? He says, well, just as Michel Adair says brusquely in that last story, you know, the idea that things move so fast that you can't get attached because you'll get a kind of vertigo if you do. So what was Cage doing? Why wouldn't he let us sit in our feelings? Why wouldn't he let us, have something a little bit longer? Was it just the perversity of a man that was not normal? Or was he really talking about what it means? He didn't feel anything was worth doing. This is a tough line. Unless the makers discovered something. And he used to say to the listeners, Happy New Ears. And he is going to make sure that you were totally, well, not totally, disoriented, because he felt that that's when things happened that were new. Now, we live in such a disorienting world right now, don't we? And everything does move so fast.
There is something worth saying, so, because Bill's clock, which is on his desk, went out. I think the batteries must have gone out.
It was beeping, it was telling me something was wrong.
But I was I had been counting on being able from my seat to see the clock, and in so doing to know where we were at in the unfurling of the evening and how much time I had spent, because I lose track of time when I'm doing this, and how much time I had left. At the point after the clock went out, at a certain point I had no idea where we were.
You too, huh?
Because I had no idea. I tried to discreetly glance at the page numbers as I was passing by in order to assess whether I had enough time to do another one or not, and how much I could give to anyone that I was doing. But I had no idea. Luckily, I recognized the last story when it began, and I knew that that's where I should stop.
And I was thinking, can we do this with, because you know, you've got to make that last story coordinate with the text. Can I just now be free of John Cage's instructions, and I just read the stories to what I think is a minute, and hope that everybody could be on the same page? And while I'm negotiating this with myself, I'm supposed to stay in the moment of what I'm doing. It was truly a Cageian moment, because the rules that I thought were there suddenly changed. Now, fortunately, between Nicholas and Kyle, I was able to get another clock, but I was prepared to do what would have been over half the piece, just guessing what a minute was. But it didn't have to happen. Was there somebody else over here? Yes, ma'am, right here.
Mine is a physical question.
Physical.
How did you, the dancer, train yourself to sit for a whole hour and not move, which was important to the piece?
To train myself? Gosh, you know, I never thought about it. I did think, of course, what pants I was going to wear. and I've got to make sure that I don't fidget, you know, because I know what that light line is. But you know, I'm so busy. Literally, and Morton Feldman says something like this, which I am using in the last lecture, but something about talking about Earl Brown, and when you have committed to a strict use of time, everything you do becomes so important, so heightened. A very smart thing those guys are also on, you know. So literally, making sure that I don't cheat. You don't know, you don't have a clock there in front of you. So I could cheat, but just making sure that every second literally counts. There's no time. I actually feel even my social face, I go for whole minutes where I realize, oh, that's kind of, that's not very nice. Let them know that I'm talking to them, you know? But actually what I have to do is watch the stories, and the heart drops when you run into stories that are really long, and you can see how long they are. Because I think, I hope I can do this without stumbling too many times, and I hope I can do this so they're able to see it, hear it, and at the same time stay with it, because I actually want you to have an emotional involvement. And I'm not sure if Cage did. Well, not always he did. You know, some stories can be like a story about my brother and his Alzheimer's. That's a very precious story, but it's a long story, and it must be read dispassionately just to get it all in. So, yeah, there's a lot of juggling going on. Just a couple more questions. Did you? Yes, there's a lady over here in the green.
Hi, thank you. I wanted to know if you could speak about the composition of the stories themselves. Were they culled from journals, or did you write it specifically this year when you knew you were creating it? And then when you were choosing the order, was it an I Ching type exercise? Or
Random.org. Nowadays we have random.org. No, you still use I Ching, don't you? You use the I Ching program, right? In writing the stories, they started, like I say, I didn't read that story tonight, but for years I've been listening to John Cage on my vacation, read Indeterminacy, because I find it relaxing and curious, and yes, perverse, you know? He's like, to me, and I've made him a straw man, he's like on Mount Olympus, you know? He doesn't have my concerns, and he's doing this very odd thing, and it's just me and him, and then I started writing my own, almost and a little angry as well. You know, any children in the house, you motherfucker, how can you be so free? Why am I free? Why am I concerned about being a nigger or being a faggot? Or why am I so concerned? You don't seem to be concerned. You're writing about mushrooms and Zen Buddhism and so on and so forth, right? Why? And I'll show you. I'm going to write from my place, you know? And that's where it started, kind of like loving him, but like take that. I'm going to use your form. And then after a while, it became its own kind of meditation. How many thoughts go through your head every day, ma'am, as you're watching things framed through in a space-time continuum? And do you have the skill to capture them and write them down in a way as economical as possible? And they have to, for the most part, a story you expect it to have a place that begins and a place that it ends. Now, these feelings and thoughts have got to be put in his little window, and that's him speaking back to me and saying, don't be angry at me, buddy. All I'm asking is that you obey this imperative. And then that's the discipline that he's putting on me. What do I think about racial looking? These are less sex. There are people who are big heroes to me. Louise Nevelson, Jasper Johns, my friend Bill Katz, Betty Freeman, wonderful woman. All these people are heroes. Louise Nevelson, as I said. Those stories are about my mother. Obviously, I have a fascination with her. You know, did you think that story about Therese and Stadt? Isn't that a curious story? You know, I've been her son all my life. And here we are in Prague, and we're sitting in a concentration camp memorial, and I realize she doesn't know what it is. She thinks it's a cemetery. And what does she say about a cemetery? If you want to learn how to pick the guitar, you've got to stay out there all night, and the next day you'll be able to play John Henry. Robert Johnson, right. Well, Robert Johnson or Lead Belly? The recording we have is Lead Belly, you know. So where do the associations come from? And then a few weeks later, driving to LaGuardia Airport, I hear a woman being interviewed on NPR, this is another story, with a new translation of Exodus. I'm writing Exodus, and under my breath, in the back of the car, I'm singing, John Henry said to the captain. So suddenly, Jewish experience, John Henry, my mother, and then one thing leads to another, not to mention nature. That's how the stories are organized.
Did you edit?
Yes. Oh, yes. Yeah, we do. They're often too long. And then we write and pull them down, and then you pull them down, and you realize, whew, 201 words, you can do it, but it's going to be a race. And then sometimes I edit it down to almost nothing. The one Edward de Vere story, it's not mine, of course. That came from a book of quotations, you know, about the fart in Queen Elizabeth I. Isn't that a great story? You know, or Hafiz. One more? Another one? Yes, sir.
Thank you for your presence here tonight and in the world. So thank you,
sir.
And I have a question about the pauses, and I'm not sure if it was as a result of the time of the clock stopping, but it created almost this kind of longing for the next word. And if those pauses were intentional, or sort of how to manage those silences. I imagine there's silences in there that are very intentional, but it felt like it was almost agonizing to hear the next word, the end of the story, or the punchline at some moments. And I just wonder about those.
Well, that's John Cage's brilliance, because, you know, for him, this was primarily a musical exercise. It's all about time and the number of words. Ted Coffey, my collaborator, has been kind enough. Some of them are actually scored like John does. If you ever look at his indeterminacy, he'll have like dots that represent 10 seconds, or 5 seconds, down through 6, and then he'll lay the words in by the second. So some of them are literally, and Ted presented me with some today. He said, now this one is a waltz, Bill. And then I heard da-da-da, da-da-da. And so I told him, Ted, I'm sorry, because he does it beautifully as a waltz. Can you imagine that? So I have to study them. Others are done, and this was in a speech last night, others are done, quote, intuitively, or you improvise your way through. And that is close to my heart, but it is supposedly, well, not supposedly, it is a bit more of a trap. Because you know how you want it to feel, and you end up doing it the same every time. And then the mentor sits over here on Olympus saying, aha, let go of that connection to that punchline or that heart-rending thing that your dad says to you in a dream, why does that the emphasis have to fall there, Bill? Why can't that be broken up to a point of being incomprehensible? Because then you will learn something new and your audience will be on the edge of its seat having an experience, and then you will all be better people because of it. Well, I'm being a bit facetious, you know. Well, that's what makes him a great artist, and I would say that is about pure inquiry. You know, burn your gods. You know, I'm attached to things in the world. Are you? Yeah, I'm not a Zen Buddhist. I would like to be, and maybe I need to be, because life is pretty rough. But that's what he was saying, get rid of attachment. Do we live in an attached era now, post-culture wars? You know, as a woman, I am a woman. And I have things that men need to know about being a woman. I am a black man, I am a gay man. There are things that I've got to stand for, right? I've been a player in that culture war, right? And maybe that's one reason I'm here tonight. So I'm also asking myself questions about, this was a time and this was a man who actually was kind of unentangled. Now, he was human as well, believe me. You know the story about his crisis in the 40s? This was whispered about for a long time, but now it's no longer whispered about. There's a book out even, a woman has written a book stating that John Cage was married to a woman named Zinnia, a very beautiful woman, musician, and so on. And he then meets Merce Cunningham. He falls in love with Merce Cunningham. But prior to that, a terrible thing had happened. Wasn't it in California, Bjorn? Where
It was another composer, I believe in California, who, having rejected the blackmail of a young man he had a relation with, was accused by this young man of having had a homosexual relation, and was disgraced and thrown in jail.
For 15 years or something?
For 15 years.
Henry Cowell.
Pardon?
Henry Cowell.
No, I'm not sure it was Henry Cowell. I didn't hear it attached to Henry Cowell. Was it Henry Cowell?
Well, he was in jail for 15
For homosexuality? Yeah. So anyways, John Cage trying to come out, quote, I don't know if they called it that, and suddenly there is this horrible thing that could happen to you. Now that's one thing. The other thing was that he felt that the work he was making, he made a piece, this is what Laura Kuhn of the Cage Trust told me, he made a piece that he thought was supposed to be very sad, and people were laughing. And he said that he made work and he looked at the world full of unemployment and war. He felt that all of his work was wrong-headed. He was trapped. Plus this idea his affections were changing and marriage was ending. Then he, I believe he met Suzuki, or he heard Suzuki. I'd already been working with an Indian classical music composer, but Suzuki really helped him understand something about lack of attachment and something about the Buddha nature in every moment, and how we could enjoy life more if we could just get our ego and our mind out of the way. And he went to Chance Procedure and Indeterminacy. That was probably in the 40s. This piece was made in first version 56 and then done in 58. So was he free? It was hard freedom. It was a difficult freedom. It came out of real stuff. And that's the difference between us. That's the difference between us. Any free people in the room? I'm serious. Any practitioners of Zen in the room? Wow. If I'd asked that question probably in the 60s or 70s. So, yeah. Well, you are?
So John Cage's freedom meant freedom from all entanglements, freedom from all relationships, or having relationships perhaps, but not caring about them?
Well, no, that would be too strong. He said that his notion of anarchy is ultimate personal responsibility. meaning you decide what is right for you, you decide how you love, who you love. That's his anarchy. I think that's, I don't want to put, I think that he was an incredibly compassionate man. But like I say to my friend here, who's very much a fan of Taoism, I sure wouldn't want to be in love with a Taoist. You know what I mean? Their notion about you push down, here comes up there. There's this long view of human relationships that sometimes seems inhuman. Why grieve? Because someone's just changed form. You know, death is, life is, why grieve? Well, some of us are attached to grieving. Should we be? He never says should. Cage never does. He didn't want people to be like he is, think like he did. That's to his great credit. I think he was just putting it out there and inspiring us to think differently. The life of an idea. Thank you very much, and good night.